Back when I used to be highly involved in youth ministry, I used to tell my students something over and over and over again, and it was this: question everything. Now, this would come as a shock to a lot of them because many of them grew up in churches or in households that basically said, well, this is what's in the Bible, these are the things that you're being told to do, and so you just shouldn't question it. Well, the reality is that there's so much in the Bible that is just buried underneath years and years and years of history and context and culture, and then there are tons of things that the reality is we probably won't understand what they fully mean until we see the completion of Revelation, when we see the second coming of Christ. And so what are we to do? Well, I can tell you what we have to avoid, and that is just simply looking at the Bible and then saying, well, this is what my heart tells me this is right now, and then not questioning it any further. What we see in Jeremiah 17:9 is this verse that people repeat over and over again, which is, the heart is above all things deceitful. And this can apply to how we read the Bible. We have to be careful to take things for what they are. Take things for what we understand them to be, given what we have right now, and not to take it as necessarily anything more. It can be so easy to read something in our 21st century way of speaking with our idioms and our culture, and to look at something and either say, well, that doesn't make any sense, or that lesson, is clearly contradictory with something else in the Bible, or to do something even worse, to take something that may seem very, very clear to us, but maybe was not written or intended to be something that was necessarily very clear to us in the here and now. We'll get into an example of that here in a little bit, but the first thing that I want to talk about is how we tend to read the Bible as something that applies to other people more so than ourselves. This is what I mean when I'm talking about that. We have this natural tendency when we read something critical to instantly think of all those other people in our lives that we think are guilty of doing a particular thing. In the Bible, there are tons of different lessons and tons of different, letters and conversations that take place that will articulate that there are certain things that people do that are bad. There are certain things that we do that are counter to the lessons of Christ and to the truth that we see revealed in the scriptures. And so often when we sit here and we hear these things about people who are judgmental, people who are sinful, people who succumb to temptation in our heads, we instantly think, oh, that's just like so-and-so, that's just like so-and-so. But the reality is, when you look at the context of how so many of these critical phrases are being thrown out there, they're being told in the context of the reader applying it to this themselves. It's intended that we take these things and we apply it to our own lives so that we can check ourselves, not so that we can sit here and judge other people. This becomes critically important because what we end up seeing is that as we use the Bible like a bludgeon against other people, it can actually push them away from the church. There's actually several different parables that we see articulated by Christ where he warns against this kind of behavior of sitting here and trying to use the Bible as some measuring stick to measure the holiness of another individual so that we can put ourselves on a pedestal, and in doing that, we might actually push away and infuriate others. So as we're reading the Bible, we have to be ever so cautious to understand that things that are in there that talk about improving ourselves, keeping ourselves accountable, trying to rectify aspects of our lives that are inconsistent and incongruent with the life with Christ, that these are lessons that we should apply to ourselves, not weaponize against other individuals. Now, that parable you may have read, or that analogy you saw there in your small group that talked about the pearls and the swine, is very, very, very important because, you see, pearls were incredibly expensive at this day and age. So really what was being articulated here by Christ was this image of us throwing these pearls, this treasured thing that we think is incredibly valuable, to these pigs, and then them turning around and getting angry. Not just because they don't appreciate it, as a lot of people will read that analogy, but because that's not what they expect. Pigs expect to be fed. That's what they want. And when they see this pearl down here, they look at it and say, this has no value to me. I want grain. I want food. And so they're going to get furious. Well, in the same way, oftentimes people will use the Bible as a bludgeon against other individuals. And in doing that, it's no wonder that they don't respond positively. Because you see, other individuals, they may not yet understand the value of this truth that we have to offer. It's like going to an individual who doesn't have a relationship with Christ and then getting mad because they don't love Christ. Well, of course, they don't fully comprehend exactly what's being offered. So we have to look at the Bible not as something to use against other individuals as a measuring stick, because it's just going to infuriate them. Instead, we should focus on other individuals the way that Christ focused on them, by loving them, by showing compassion for them, by being charitable for them, by serving them. In this way, we don't infuriate them, but instead we show them that side of ourselves that lives and that endures because we have a relationship with Christ. Now, the opposite effect can also happen when we read the Bible, not necessarily the fact that, we see critical things and we apply them to other people, but that we see positive things and we always want to apply them to ourselves. There's a phrase that I've used many, many times in different contexts where I've said that, nobody is the villain inside the movie that plays inside their head. Now, I'll use this phrase frequently in order to just say that if somebody's doing something that irritates you or that you think is offensive, you have to understand that in their head, they're probably doing something that makes a lot of sense. And if we can understand that, then we can get to a place of compromise. But in this context, I mention that because the corollary of that is that a lot of people are the hero in the movie that plays on in their head. They see the stories in the Bible and they see these different patriarchs and these different heroes and whatnot, and they like to impose themselves onto the place of these, these great men, these great women of the Bible. But in reality, when we do that, we actually cheapen part of the message of what's intended to be taken away. A good example of this is David. In your small groups, you'll sit here and read about this in a second, but people love to talk about the fact that, we are David and we are here to slay the giants in our lives. And you can take that lesson away from it, but when you do that, it takes away this amazing allegory that we see in the person of David, not as ourselves come to slay giants, but instead, David, a Messiah, who came to save God's chosen people, God's children, from a force that they couldn't save themselves from. When you think about the story that way, doesn't that sound so much more magnificent than just simply us overcoming some kind of, workplace trauma or some kind of obstacle in our own lives that's keeping us from doing what we want to do? The reality is that the Bible is written not necessarily about us to glorify ourselves, but instead it is written to glorify God. And when we start looking at the stories and the anecdotes and the parables and everything else in the scriptures for what is actually intended to be a story of God's glory, we are able to understand even better where we stand and why a relationship with this God is so critically important. Now, when we talk about misreading the Bible, at least from an egotistical perspective, you can definitely look at how we tend to apply negative things to other people and how we tend to apply very heroic, positive things towards ourselves. But there's also a third way that a lot of us will tend to misread the scriptures when it comes to our own egotism. And that more comes from the context from which we read the Bible. We tend to look at ourselves in today's day and age and think that we are so advanced and we have so much information, that we are so smart and educated, and because of that, clearly the way that I'm reading this is the way it was actually intended. The reality is that the Bible is very, very complicated. It's complicated because it's very old. There's a lot of things that exist today that didn't exist back then, and I don't just mean technology. I mean entire ways of thinking, entire philosophies that people didn't have back then that we have today. And so just simply for that matter alone, there's a tendency to read the Bible with our own philosophies and worldviews and to put them on top of the Bible and then start taking things away that maybe aren't actually intended to be there. There's the cultural clash that exists in there. Not just simply a matter of it being old, but the fact that their entire society was based on norms that are very different than our own. And this is where sometimes having the very academic research into the Bible does actually provide a little bit of benefit. But then the other thing that we have to deal with as well is the fact that there are actually connections in the Bible between things that occurred previously, things that happen after, and things that are still yet to come. These connections can make it so difficult to understand the full picture, and that creates a very real danger that we end up moving forward and, maybe even engaging in certain actions on the basis that, quote unquote, I know exactly what the Bible means, when in reality, we maybe don't know as much as we think. You saw the Pharisees fall into this trap over and over again where they would approach Christ and constantly they, knew exactly what the correct answer was. You can see these examples of the Pharisees testing Christ and trying to give him these highly theological, philosophical questions that they knew the correct answer to, but they knew it'd be a logical trap for Christ. But in reality, when you look at the responses of Christ, they were calm, they were measured, but they were also fueled by the fact that Christ does have knowledge of eternity, and he does know how the story ends. As we sit here and we look at our own interpretations of the Bible, it's important to understand that some things that we as Christians will use as objects of division between ourselves and between us and the rest of the world are actually things that are based on our own interpretations, especially contemporary interpretations of something that we may not even fully understand. It would be very easy to hear this whole thing and think that I'm somehow advocating for a very liberal interpretation of the Bible where everything is very squishy and it's up to interpretation of whatever you want to think. And nothing could be further than the truth. The Bible is based on truth. It is based on unchanging truth. God's truth that has never changed and will never change. What changes over time is our ability to understand what is in that truth. Just as we end up seeing that the prophets did not have a full understanding of precisely how the Messiah was going to manifest himself. Just as we saw that the Pharisees felt they understood the scriptures, but there was revelation that they had still yet to achieve. And just as how the disciples, even themselves, had some different views and perspectives on Christ that would end up later not being true, we stand here today as individuals that are finite in nature. We stand as individuals that have a limited perspective on an eternity that God can see in its entirety. And so as we do that, we have to pick and choose what we feel needs to be put up on a pedestal. Is it our academic understanding of the scriptures and our legalistic adherence to its laws and its precepts? Or is it living a life in a way that Christ instructed? The one thing that is crystal clear, that could not be up for debate in any way, shape, or form when we look at the teachings of Christ, is that Christ was about love. He was about compassion. He was about serving other individuals. These are the things that churches should be holding as number one on their list of priorities. These are the things that Christians should be hoping to live out in their day-to-day life. We need to study our Bible. We need to have all these other things that, help to keep ourselves accountable, that help to strengthen us and to grow us as individuals. But we can't lose sight of what is truly important. That is the love and the grace that Christ first showed us. And our priority should be showing that to a hurting world that surrounds us each and every single day. That's our lesson that I have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.